I den här inspelningen samtalar Lunds universitets moderator Martin Degrell med James Mansell och Sanne Krog Groth om olika perspektiv på ljud.
And it's 2 o'clock here at Lund University's booth at the book fair. My name is Martin Degrell. I am here with Sanne Krog Groth and James G. Mansell. We are here to talk about this book, Negotiating Noise Across Places, Spaces and Disciplines. And Sanne is an associate professor in musicology and office director of the Sound Environment Center at Lund University. And James is associate professor in the Department of Cultural, Media and Visual Studies at the University of Nottingham. And we're going to talk about this book. It's an anthology about really what surrounds us right now, which is noise, right? Noise in everyday life and environments. Could you tell me a little bit about the origins of this book?
Well, actually, yes, if we listen to the place we are in right now, this could be the origin of the book. This is a highly complex soundscape we have around us. It invites for different kinds of research, both within, of course, acoustics, electroacoustics, physical listening, and cultural things. There are power structures here going on, who is fighting for the old space. And as you can hear, there are so many disciplines active within this sound setting. And that was the original idea.
So it's quite appropriate that we're here right now.
Yeah.
What could you tell us about the Negotiating Noise project?
Yeah, so the starting point was to try and bring together the different kinds of disciplines that are involved in managing or creating or trying to make sense of what noise is. And I think actually our two positions as scholars tells you something quite interesting about that. So Sanne is involved in researching artists who use noise in their music, or their music is noise, and I research people who try and suppress and reduce noise in urban environments and other places. And so there are all these different kinds of disciplines. There are architects, there are musicians, there are philosophers, there are psychologists, and so we thought, let's bring those people together, because often they don't talk to each other. We had observed that actually even the two of us would tend not to have a conversation across our quite connected disciplines. And so we wanted to bring all of those different positions, disciplines and practices together and give them a place in the book, so each different kind of author would have a chapter. But then we wanted to try and fuse those people together and make them negotiate by asking them to create manifestos for their future work. So we would put an architect together with a philosopher, together with a doctor, and ask them to come up with a joint manifesto for what research might be if they each, in combination, had to do something together in the future. So we really wanted to bring those disciplines together to see what would happen if they had an interface and could talk to each other for the first time.
Right, so you mentioned that noise sort of means different things depending on what kind of discipline you're in. Could you give us any examples of that? Like, how have you come across that sort of meeting of the minds, if you will, when it comes to this book and the project?
Well, for example, in the Sound Environment Center that I represent now, and who also published the book, there has previously been a lot of focus on silence, and that noise was a very bad thing for you, and silence was absolutely the best thing for everyone. And I think people traveling to Scandinavia see that maybe a bit, not very problematic, but maybe very special that we treat silence the way we do. So with the book and the project, we wanted to swap it around a bit and say, okay, what if we actually just interrogate noise instead of just leaving it out and try to embrace the noise? And noises are different, of course. If we also collaborated a lot with scholars from the global south, from Malaysia and Vietnam and Indonesia, among Singapore. And definitely the discussions really were very fruitful of having that mirroring of the concept in both places, both on the northern hemisphere and in the southern hemisphere.
Right. So you write, well, a number of the authors in this book write about the sort of the complex nature, almost sometimes contradictory nature of noise, like what is it and how it sort of transforms over context or time. Can you say anything about that, the sort of the multifaceted aspect of noise, if you will?
Certainly my research focuses on the way in which noise is something that's highly dependent on context and historical period. So I write about the 1930s when a number of new technologies are emerging, like the motor car, like the gramophone and radio. And at that time, there was an almost a moral panic that those things would be so noisy that they would stop people reading books, for example. Over here at a book fair, there was a genuine fear in the 1930s that, you know, people would listen to the radio and drive their motor cars, and they would be so distracted that they would stop reading. And
so in that context, radio could be like
a noise.
That noise.
Yeah. There was a real fear that your next door neighbor would turn their radio on so loud that you wouldn't be able to think or to sleep. And in some of the research that I've done in blocks of flats, they gave the caretaker the control to turn everyone's radio off at the same time. So 10 p.m. everyone's radio is off.
Wow. So noise, multifaceted, can be disruptive, oppressive, could be seen as pollution, could be seen as whatever this is, but and threats to the environment, of course. But it also can be radical. It could be a form of creative endeavors, socially productive. Sunny, in your chapter of the book, you have studied experimental noise music in Indonesia. Can you talk about a little bit about that, the study you have made, and what specifically the concept of noise bombing, which I found very interesting.
Yes, in that chapter, I speak as a musicologist, and speak about the project I'm conducting right now together with my partner Niels Buband. And we call it anthropological aesthetic methods, combining more traditional musicological methods with anthropological. And these noise bombings is a really interesting phenomenon. So I think it started as graffiti bombings, that people came out in the street at night doing a big painting, and then the next day, the government would obviously be furious about this. The noise bombings, we are in Yogyakarta in central Java in Indonesia. And the noise bombings are that you go to the street corner, you bring your speakers and your gear, your electronic gear, and you just make a small noise concert at the street corner. And you should think that this would be very provocative. It would definitely be if you did that out in Gothenburg or somewhere else. But in Indonesia, the level of traffic noise and just everyday noise is actually higher. We measured that with a decibel measure. So the level of just the everyday noise was higher than the noise intervention was, which is also interesting. So one of our questions in the overall research project is why make noise in a place that is so noisy, and that's really something. Right. It's a different way of thinking noise and experiencing noise there.
Yeah, there seems to be kind of an irony about the sort of the noise bombing in a place where it sort of really doesn't make a dent in the sound environment.
Yes, but as I also write in the chapter, that there are, of course, very performative issues that makes it as something noticeable in the street environment, and that people do stop and start looking at these people. So there is definitely a bombing happening, but the noise is definitely negotiable, I would say.
Right. And James, in your chapter, you write that what counts as noisy is less self-evident than it might seem. And we come back to the sort of the contextual discussion about noise. What is noise, and for whom?
Yes, I think when I talk to people on an everyday basis, there's a common understanding of what noise is. It's something that disturbs you, or it's the background that we find noisy. But when you look at the historical sources, the archives, you see actually lots of effort goes into promoting a version of what counts as noisy. So if you as a group of people decide that motor cars are noisy, you run all sorts of public information campaigns to construct a narrative around why the motor car is noisy in a problematic way. And so in the past, in the period that I was looking at, the early 20th century, those campaigns to create noise as a problem were both about a certain kind of fear of technology, but they were also reproducing other forms of social relations. So they would tell you something about class difference, and they would tell you something about gender difference. So, for example, one of the technologies that's seen as being problematically noisy is the typewriter in the office. And the people complaining about the typewriter are the people who identify themselves as brain workers and were male, largely complaining about their nearby female typists, and the noise of the typewriter becomes not just a technological problem, but a kind of gendered problem of a feminized noise. And so noise becomes not just something that helps us understand how problems are generated and dealt with by scientists, but also something that tells us about how we live together as people in a society, how noise is something that reveals the relations between different classes of people, different genders of people, and it's a very rich resource for doing history. And you can excavate those social relations by trying to understand how noise was produced as a cultural form, whether in language or in visualizations. You know, the typewriter had lightning bolts coming off it to show the kind of physical assault that the typewriter noise was supposedly having on the brains of the office workers nearby.
And so you look, for instance, you look at legislative attempts to sort of control noise in the UK. What can you tell about that? I was sort of fascinated by this, the Anti-Noise League, and its wonderfully titled magazine, Quiet Please.
Quiet Please, yes. We still have an anti-noise league in the UK. It's called the Noise Abatement Society, and it actively works to promote legislation around, for example, the time that lorries can deliver to supermarkets, which sounds innocuous, but if you happen to live near a supermarket, you might very well care about when the lorries do their deliveries. And what's interesting about these campaigns is that you look at the present day ones, and it all seems very sensible, and you think, oh yes, that makes sense. Lorries delivering early in the morning, that must be very annoying. But if you go back 50 years, the first major piece of legislation was in 1960, and you see a whole different set of class expectations and relations, a whole language around the problem of people that don't appreciate quiet in a way that would be totally unacceptable today. And we might say this is true of lots of things. You know, there are lots of instances where people held beliefs that now are outdated. But actually, what's interesting is that you see that those beliefs about society find an expression through sound in the same way that they do through language, and that by putting together language, text, image and sound, how we understand what sounds mean, we maybe get a fuller picture of what class relations mean, what gender relations mean. And I think by tracing those back through history and looking at those moments of legislative action, like in 1960, we see not just changes in law, but changes in social relations, social expectations and social norms.
Right. There's this idea that sort of comes up in the book of a natural state of quietness. Should we consider that sort of a myth? Is that something we should sort of fantasize about? How do you interpret that as impossible to grasp, kind of impossible to meet that natural state of quietness?
I think, yeah, there is. It's a continuum, maybe, that there is almost quietness, and then there is more or less quietness, you could say. But it also depends on who's listening and who is experiencing the quietness. And sometimes, I think I write that at the end of my chapter, that in a concert hall, if the pedal from the grand piano is squeaking, that can be extremely noisy. Whether in here, if
whereas
you know,
here.
yeah, it would have definitely a different meaning. So I think that's one of the points with our book, is also really to contextualize the experience of silence, even though we call it negotiating noise. But it's not just to say that take out your decibel measure and say, oh, now it's silent, so everything is good. Because we also have one of the authors, Sandra Lori Petersen. She's an anthropologist, and she has been writing about neighborships. And it's really interesting because some of the things that are annoying is, from one of her interviews, is that the neighbors are whispering at night, and she can hear that. And being part of that intimate space, you can't really measure that on any instruments. But the whole idea of just being part of your neighbors' late night whispering, you don't want that, and that's noisy as well.
Right. So you start this project off with the big question: what is noise? And I'm not going to push you to answer that in the last seconds we have here, but what's next with this project? Are you continuing with your research in various ways?
I think both of us are interested in pursuing the question of cultural difference. So one of the things that I've been very interested in my own research is to try and internationalize the way I'm looking at the culture of noise in Britain and think about the way in which that culture was exported and then resisted in the British Empire in places like Singapore. Some of our authors brought up very interesting histories in which, you know, that the culture of quietness and expectation of a norm of quietness that made sense in Britain made no sense when it was exported to other places in the world that had different sorts of ways of making sense of sound. And I think this is something that we share as a common interest.
And another interest is also the transdisciplinarity that we will keep on stimulating, both in our own research, but also within the Sound Environment Center. And that's the question about noise and sound is just so complex that you can't just take it from one point of view. You have to engage with at least 3 different scholars, I would say. Yeah.
The book is called Negotiating Noise Across Places, Spaces and Discipline. Sanne and James, thank you very much for being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.